Advanced Training ASG Cloud Factory Understand and Install Web Secure Logon. Part 2, Windows Backend. In this particular training, this video tutorial, now we'll be covering the installation and how it works, the Web Secure Logon. In the learners and objectives, in this advanced training, we'll be covering the following. Review ASG Web Secure Logon capabilities. Requirements for the backend installation of WSL. Basic installation. Configuring the application for using WSL. As we have seen previously in this training material, we already deployed a front-end server, which is a Linux base in this case. But just to remind you, we can also use a Windows version for implementations. Web Secure Logon is a component of the Cloud Cockpit, and it works closely with Cloud Cockpit Workspace. Basically, it enables us to access applications, even if they are called from an unsecure environment, like the internet, and creating a tunnel between you and the infrastructure. We also provide certificates, support, radios, Cloud Cockpit one-time password, SMS, and of course Windows Live ID and SAML to specific applications that you want to integrate, such as Google Apps, Office 365, Salesforce.com, and others. The logon via username and password, of course, can be also done via regular login ID. When we talk about the WSL concept, we always have two different components. We have the WSL front-end piece, and we have the WSL backend, which combined creates a secure tunnel for an authentication perspective and application delivery. This particular process, it's divided in two different phases. The first one, you always deploy the front-end piece first, and then you can deploy the backend component, which usually uses Windows for that. So let's take a look in a little bit more details in this particular diagram. So looking the front-end server that we have discussed before, it is the front end for your end users accessing your applications, the dynamic workspace, cockpit, cloud store, from the outside world. For that application to be authenticated, we must have a communication first with the WSL backend server. And the backend server, it will be responsible to, first of all, authenticate the user. So you're not exposing your Active Directory to the internet. You can cache user information. You can do authentication real time. It depends on the model you want to use from a high availability and performance perspective. And the second piece, what WSL performs, is user cache, as we just mentioned, and single sign-on. And for that matter, we separate the authentication process and user cache in a different database, or different databases, if you will. And these databases, they run on SQL Server. And in our test demo environment, we have a dedicated SQL Server. But in production environments, you might have your SQL cluster for that matter. Now, what is the process to deploy the backend server? So we will follow 4 different steps. First of all, what are the requirements? They are described in the documentation, but essentially we need to have the .NET framework installed, IIS, and ASP.NET. And you can also increase the security, defining ports in the Windows firewall to only allow certain ports to communicate, like what we did in the front-end server. The second piece would be the basic installation, which is a typical installation and connecting the WSL backend into the Cloud Factory administration. We will connect the servers, from a logical perspective, and we'll be configuring a couple of applications. In fact, we'll be configuring Cloud Cockpit for that part. So moving to the requirements part, what do we see? So we have on the left side the IIS modules. As you can see, we need to install ASP.NET. I actually use both versions just in case. And on the right side, it is the server description if you want to have that information described in more details for end users. So Windows 2008 R2 is the minimum requirement. Windows Server 2012 is okay. Microsoft .NET framework, as we just saw on the left side. The backend components, notification server, optional if you want to do single sign-on password sync, we will use that. And we need to be careful when you deploy the database. What is the database configuration? So we'll be using collation designator sort order Latin underscore general. With that being said, we can move to the next slide, which begins the basic installation. And the installation process will be done in 5 different steps: the WSL front end, the WSL backend, publishing cockpit and store. We will do the URL in cockpit, testing to make sure logon and login works properly, and finally testing. For the backend installation, the installation packages, it's located under Cloud Cockpit Secure Logon, and we will follow the same steps from the documentation. So the first step to do is run the start backend setup. So double click here. We'll validate if we have all of the components. So everything's passed. We'll accept the agreement. Use the default IIS folder. If you have a different folder, you can specify over here. The pools that the application will be running, or we'll be using the default options. And once the process is completed, we can make sure the pages are responding properly. So in the documentation, we can see there are 2 different URLs. So let me just copy from the documentation here. And we can use them just to make sure that everything is working well. So we can copy this one, place in the browser, making sure we use the correct name. Okay, the page responded. That's good news. And now we can carry on to the database installation. And for that, we're going to do the VSLDB setup. And we install the installer. Okay, we can use now the wizard, and the wizard will say the DB server. Let's use for now integrated authentication. So this is the first time we're going to create a database. We're going to use the same database format. And I won't install the audit at this point. And let's see how the process goes. All the databases have been created. To configure the WSL component now, we go to Cloud Factory, Administration Console, and we will set up the WSL option called Secure Logon. We're connecting to the database. We click Close over here, and here on Secure Logon, we right-click, New Secure Logon Environment. So we're checking the connection to the master service. The first time we will say we don't have it. But as you can see, we already populated the database information. So we need to configure where the server is located. So we click on Set. Database name server is DB. And the password is the one we used a few minutes ago to configure the database. Click on Test Connection. Successful. OK. Let's save the configuration now. And let's configure the WSL front end and the backend servers. Just a little bit different from the previous screen. I wanted just to test the configuration before showing you this particular steps. And there are certain things we need to keep in mind from a WSL Linux perspective. So first of all, let's add the front end server. So I'll click Add, and I use Manual Linux. And the process here is very simple. I will use the server name. In my case is WSL4CC. The IP address is 192.168.3.17, like the previous example. WSL.cfdemo.local. Now, you can see here the URL can be different from one environment to another. So just make sure this particular URL is defined properly. And then you can set as a master server. The previous entry can be deleted. And now let's add the backend server. Very simple too. So it's a master, the WSL CFDemo the IP address, the FQDN, and the notification services. If you have only one server for the backend, you can change the base URL here to be your server. So in this case, it's our WSL.cfdemo.local BE services. And that's complete, the configuration. So we need to save and click Apply Changes. If you did everything right, we will see the application response saying everything has been properly done. And here is configuration applied successfully. Now that we have the basic configuration completed, we need to do two more things. The first one is review the system options for single sign-on. And the second one, the resources, which means the applications we want to publish. So the process here is also very simple. You unlock, so we can edit. We're going to use the database string. So let's just make sure this is done properly again. So the database server in our case is DB. I'll type in the password, test the connection, click OK. And I will use or define the Active Directory piece that we need to define. So in this case, I will be using my own Active Directory. So where is the Active Directory installed? It is installed in my domain controller, cfdemo.local. There's no failover, so I'll put the same server. I will add the NetBIOS name, which is cfdemo. I'll verify the authentication type. In this case will be name password. And here you can define different user IDs and passwords. I haven't created one specifically for the AD inquiries. So in my case, I will be using my CFDemo administrator. I'll type my password. The bad server timeout, and now we need to configure the root directory, which is dc cfdemo dc local. Let's make sure there's no spaces. And now let's set the cryptography for our SSO. Here you need to create the keys that you want, so you define the length as you're required to do. I'll set the communication key as well. Click OK. Let's save it. So now let's set up the resources. Let's click on Edit exclusively. Let's create a new template. This template here will be called as Cloud Cockpit. Active Directory, and the parameters will be reading it's the domain that we just created. We'll save it. Now let's go to the applications, create a new application. So I'll make this a little bit bigger here. I'll call it Cloud Cockpit. The path here will be the same as we created for the application server in the Linux backend or the other VSLs or WSLs you created. So here will be Cloud Cockpit. The template is the one that we just created, and here we'll select the groups that can access these applications. So let's say here in hosting, we can add different groups in hosting or any user from the domain. So I'll just say domain users in our case. Add, OK. We'll be installing as well Cloud Store. So we can add another application for Cloud Store. So I will call here Cloud Store, and here will be Cloud Store. Be careful, this is case sensitive. So that's the reason the C and the S, they are uppercase. Same thing I did before. I'll select the group that I want, users, and here we'll put domain users. Let's save, and let's move to domains. We need to add the external URL that we're going to use here. So we can use, for example, mycfdemo.local. The root domain here will be cfdemo.local. Default application will be Cloud Cockpit. And the authentication method. And don't forget to add authentication plugins. Here we can say we can use username and password. And I'll enable one-time password as well. But if you want, we can use SNS, SML plugin, or other authentication types. We'll click OK. Click on Save. And let's apply those settings. Configuration applied. And the final piece, for us to have the configuration completed, we need to change a couple of settings in Cloud Cockpit Farm. So we go to Basic Configuration, Vision App Config. The default login type will be changed from Basic to Forms. We save it. And under Configuration Values, we need to change the logoff URL from the standard URL to this different version to use VSL DMZ services. Be careful, it is case sensitive. We save one more time and the configuration will be saved.